So once again, bonjour, good morning, salam. My name is Vrinda Narayan, Associate Professor at McGill University's Faculty of Law, and I'm a member of the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. Together with the Transnational Solidarity Network, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, or WLUML, we're very pleased to welcome you to our webinar, The Evolution and Potential of Jihad from Violence to Peace Building. This webinar is an integral part of WLUML's campaign, No Peace Without Women's Rights in Afghanistan, to support women's demands for meaningful participation in the Afghan peace process. I take this opportunity to say a few words about the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. It is a focal point for innovative legal and interdisciplinary research, dialogue, and outreach on issues of human rights and legal pluralism. The Center's mission is to provide students, professors, and indeed the wider community the possibility for intellectual and physical resources to engage critically with law's impact on some of the most compelling issues of our times. Women Living Under Muslim Laws is a transnational feminist solidarity network that promotes human rights and gender justice and equality for people whose lives are shaped, conditioned, or governed by patriarchal and authoritarian interpretations of Islam. WLUML recognizes that women's struggles are interconnected and complementary, and therefore has a commitment to transnational solidarity and the promotion of human rights both within and outside of Muslim contexts. And WLUML is actively promoting pluralist democracies, endorsing plurality, and recognizing and valuing a diversity of opinions. So I'd like to now introduce our distinguished speakers in the order that they're going to speak. This is going to be a short introduction, and we will be putting their longer bios in the chat. Naureen Shameem is an activist and human rights lawyer. She's a board member of WLUML and was previously Women and Justice Fellow with the Global Centre for Women and Justice at Cornell Law School, where she taught and supervised projects at the International Human Rights Clinic. Naureen has also worked with WLUML in the ILO, the Red Cross, and the Human Dignity Trust. She has an academic background in women's rights, religion, and international law, and holds a graduate degree from Harvard Law School. Dr. Ayşe Kadayefci Orayana is a research affiliate at Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security and professor at Georgetown University. Her experience includes research programming in conflict resolution and development in the MENA region, intergroup and interfaith mediation and dialogue facilitation. She's the author of many books. I'm just going to name one, the Standing on an Isthmus, Islamic Narratives of War and Peace in the Palestinian Territories. And the rest, the list is very long, we'll put it in the chat. Next is Dr. Rumi Ahmed, Professor of Islamic Law at the University of British Columbia. His publications include 2 monographs on Islamic law titled Sharia Compliant, a User's Guide to Hacking Islamic Law, and Narratives of Islamic Legal Theory. Finally, we'll have Dr. Huma Hudfar, who will offer some closing reflections. She's Professor Emerita of Anthropology at Concordia University. Her areas of expertise are political economy and legal anthropology, focusing on reproductive rights, Afghan women and youth refugees in Iran and Pakistan, women in formal and informal politics, hijab and dress codes as political institutions. I'll end there, and I will hand over now to Naureen. Please, Naureen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Thank you to the center and to the distinguished panelists. I'd like to just pick up from where Brenda left off, just to set a little bit more of the context leading into this exciting discussion. So in that case, I'll be speaking a little bit more about WLUML, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, the transnational network that is co-hosting this discussion, as well as an introduction to the campaign, which is underpinning and influencing a number of these discussions as well. As Brenda highlighted, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, or WLUML, is a transnational feminist solidarity network that works across contexts, aiming to promote human rights and gender justice and equality for people whose lives are shaped, conditioned, or governed by patriarchal or authoritarian interpretations of Islam. To give a bit of a sense, briefly, a few words in terms of its background. WLUML was formed back over 3 decades ago in response to 3 urgent cases in Muslim countries and communities in which women were being denied rights by reference to laws said to be Muslim. At this point, 9 women from Algeria, Morocco, Sudan, Iran, Mauritius, Tanzania, Bangladesh, and Pakistan came together in support of local women's struggles and to challenge the devastating impact of fundamentalisms and militarisms on women's rights, which we continue to see in different permutations today. Now, for more than 3 decades, WLUML has been linking individual women and organizations working on the ground. And the idea of WLUML and its name is to challenge the myth of one homogenous Muslim world. This myth, the network and its members feel, fails to reflect that laws said to be Muslim vary from one context to another. And secondly, that the laws that determine our lives as women in different Muslim contexts are from diverse sources: religious, customary, colonial, and secular. And thus we are governed simultaneously by many different laws, including informal laws such as customary practices. The focus of the network also is, as in terms of some of its activities, is to thus support feminist local struggles for individual and collective autonomy within Muslim countries and contexts by facilitating this transnational solidarity network, building and mobilizing knowledge, and furthering channels of communication and exchange towards realization of human rights. The network aims also to strengthen these collective struggles and individual struggles for equality and their rights in Muslim contexts by breaking the isolation in which often women wage their struggles, by creating and reinforcing linkages between women within Muslim countries and communities, and by sharing expertise, information, and analysis that helps demystify the diverse sources of control over women's lives, and strategies and experiences of challenging discrimination and control. And lastly, segueing into the campaign, supporting members and collective solidarity actions and campaigns. And so lastly, in terms of some of the backdrop to this discussion, WLUML, together with partners in Afghanistan and the region, last year launched the No Peace Without Women's Rights in Afghanistan campaign in support of women's demands for meaningful engagement in the Afghan government-Taliban peace talks. In terms of the positionality of the network, while engaging in peace talks based on justice and respect for human rights is key, of course, to a long-lasting peace, WLUML sees the exclusion of women and the UN from peace talks with the Taliban as part of a disturbing trend and a potential precedent to even broader exclusions of civil society and advocates of women's human rights in the wider region. The lack of meaningful participation of women was underlined again recently, as we may have seen, by the single woman delegate who attended the recent Moscow talks. As there is no evidence that the Taliban have reassessed their extreme approach to the rights of women, girls, and minorities, the Taliban's return to power endangers Afghan women and the legal and democratic gains that they have advocated for over the past decades. And it may have significant consequences for women living in Muslim contexts worldwide as a transnational network, as diverse fundamentalists see this as a vindication of their regressive gender ideologies. Indeed, as they have been ostensibly taking part in the peace process, in recent months, there has been a significant increase in assassinations of women human rights defenders, members of Afghan civil society, journalists, and elected representatives, including 2 female Supreme Court justices tied to the Taliban. More women indeed were killed in 2020 than any other year over the last decade. Thus, WLUML and its partners believe that real peace requires the active presence of women's human rights defenders in the peace process, firstly, and secondly, the protection of women's human rights in its outcomes. The demands are available online, but just to speak in brief, include advocating for immediate and complete ceasefire, meaningful and substantial participation of Afghan women, enforcement of women's and citizens' rights currently enshrined in the Constitution, protection of the full range of women's human rights and the outcomes of the peace process, the involvement of the UN, including general experts in peace talks, equal protection of all citizens before the law, regardless of gender, ethnicity, or religion, the autonomy of civil society, that it is made part of the peace agreement, as well as that of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, and the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Forum. Lastly, just to say that over 2,000 women worldwide have written in support of these demands, and earlier this month, 10,000 women in Afghanistan called for the protection of women's rights in the peace process. And so to support women human rights defenders' advocacy in support of women and peace building in this fraught moment and beyond, together with partners and here today, we're delighted to facilitate the series of discussions and exchanges, sharing of views and knowledge on progressive religious interpretations supportive of women's human rights and on constitutionalizing women's rights. Thank you again.
Thanks very much, Naureen. Now invite Aisha, please.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you for the Center and the WLUML for organizing this event and for the important work that you're doing. I prepared a PowerPoint I would like to share with you very quickly, and I will keep my eye on the time to make sure I don't exceed my time. So, very quickly. I just want to make sure that you can see the PowerPoint. Excellent.
Yes,
and
we see it. Thank you, Aisha.
And here we go. And I want to make sure that I have my chat on so I don't miss. Okay, thank you so much. I'll be talking one of the most misunderstood concepts in the Islamic tradition, the concept of jihad, and how the interpretation or the understanding of jihad evolved over the centuries. And if we look at actually, I started looking into this question in 1997 for a research that I was doing at the time. And I also came into this area with a lot of misunderstandings and misperceptions myself, even as a Muslim. But the more I sort of delved into it, one of the things that really stood out for me is that the centrality of peace and nonviolence within the Islamic tradition, which has been really lost over the decades. And so just wanted to start with I wanted to put jihad in the context of peace because they are really, really very intricately sort of related. So if the word Islam comes from the word salam, which means peace, and the peace in Islam starts with the word salam, which is a divine attribute, one of the 99 names of God. And so there's so many references to peace in the Quran in its various different derivatives. And together with the word, with justice, peace, one can see is the central message of the faith. And it's not a peace in the sense of negative peace, what we would call the absence of war, but an oppression. But the Quranic understanding of peace focuses on what we would call a positive peace, presence of justice, ability for every human being, and in fact, if you look at it, every creature to fulfill their full potential. And so one of the things that I've been doing for years is to look at the principles of peace in Islam, working with a lot of practitioners in actual on the ground. So we have identified a number of different principles of peace in Islam that range from pluralism through tawheed, dignity and sacredness of humanity through fitra, social empowerment through khayr and ihsan with the principle of stewardship, khalifa, justice, Rahman and Rahim. These are all different elements of it. So when there is so much emphasis on peace, how do we have the word jihad and the way it is understood by Muslims and non-Muslims alike to mean violence in a way that is very destructive? So the word jihad comes from the Arabic word that means striving, to struggle, as it is in the verse, to strive in the cause of God. And it doesn't mean fighting, or it doesn't mean war. there are different terms for that. Harb and Qital are the terms used for that. And both the Hadith tradition and the Quranic tradition emphasizes that this struggle for justice, which is also must be seen within the context of the Sharia, according to Islamic tradition, there's a purpose. The purpose, maqasid of Sharia, is for common good. And why we do struggle for this common good, for justice, for equality, there are different ways we can achieve it. And these range from through speech, through our property, through our wealth, and through our life. So the concept of jihad is definitely nothing related to holy war as it is understood today, but it's a struggle. It's the exerting effort to bring more of a just, fair, equitable society that would address the needs of not only humans, but also all of God's creation. So the direction of jihad, we will see is that there's an inner direction, which is the jihad of inner jihad. We're focusing on the jihad of against our egos, our own selfish interests, our own weaknesses. And there's an outer jihad, which could be jihad against the visible enemy, or what we would call the shaitan, the devil. And jihad can be performed violently or non-violently. And we'll see that in the Quranic and the Hadith literature, there is a specific preferred non-violent method that is emphasized, and violence in this form of self-defense is allowed to be used under very strict and specific conditions. So the idea of these three forms of jihad comes from the Hadith tradition in particular, where the Prophet, peace be upon him, has been recorded to have said, we have returned from the minor jihad to the major jihad against the self. The best jihad is to perform jihad against one's own self and against his desires. So, and there's so many other verses that really make sure that from an Islamic point of view, aggression, initiating hostilities is something that is banned, especially in the context of pursuing our own self-interest. And there's so many verses to support that. So military jihad, while permitted under strict conditions, must be the last resort and must be fought in the best of manners. So Muslims over centuries have the understanding of jihad has evolved over centuries, and despite that, they all had to base their interpretation on Islamic sources, mainly the Quran and the Hadith and the Sunnah. And when these texts have not addressed a question directly, they have used interpretive sources, the ijtihad, to sort of come up with their own understanding of the terms. So the transformation of the concept of jihad correlates between the evolution of the Islamic empires over the century. So it's been impacted, for example, when the Islam came down first during the time of the Prophet, the context in which it came down was very tribal. There was a constant state of war. And although there were only certain months that fighting was not allowed, the current state that was based on honor, war, and so that was the environment in which it appeared. And this also, we have to also put this in the context of the major wars between Byzantium, the major empires at the time, the Sassanid, the Sarmatian revolts, Byzantium, and all of this had an impact of how Muslims understood and interpreted the jihad. Later on, we see that the concept of jihad also has been influenced by the experience of colonialism, declining military power, a sense of feeling inferior against the European superiority, and then later on nationalism and the disintegration of Muslim states, among many others. So also the sense of how Muslims felt powerful and powerless really impacted the way we sort of understood that. So just very quickly, when we look at the tradition of Islam and jihad, we see that in the beginning, in the Mecca years, the Muslims were demanded to be completely non-violent, whereas Muslims were first allowed to defend themselves when they established a state. which the state has different responsibilities than individuals, where individuals are asked to be nonviolent, states have to protect its citizens. But even in that context, there has been a very strong restrictions of war and peace in Islamic tradition. So these elements were collected in 8th century by Shaybani, who was a student of Abu Hanifa, in a book called Introduction, it's called the CR, and this was translated into English by Majid Kaduri, which really clearly sort of delineates and identifies when Muslims can go to war and the kind of ways in which they could fight. This is very similar to what we called jus ad bellum and jus in bello understandings of in the international law terminology today. But this was articulated around 7th, 8th centuries. And so just very quickly, there in Islamic tradition, war can be allowed under very strict conditions, which has to be on legitimate reason, which is to repel invasion or its threat, where it's imminent. And so who violated those treaties, and if there is a persecution of Muslims and there's no other way. But even so, it has to be proclaimed by the right legitimate authority. It has to follow certain legitimate rules, and the intention has to be really, really important, clear, and for the sake of God. It cannot be for any other gain. And also there are very strict regulations. These are very clearly defined in the Prophet's tradition, as well as the Rashidun who came after him, the Prophets, the caliphs who were the righteous guided caliphs. And they're very strict division, Muslims are not allowed to kill non-combatants. And these were articulated, identified in the CR tradition. I'm not going to read all of them, but there were also very strict ways in which prisoners were to be treated. You couldn't kill, you couldn't hurt them, you couldn't use certain kinds of, you cannot use poison, you cannot use any method that will not be able to distinguish between civilians and warriors, and all those captives had to be protected. And both this is mentioned in the Quran as well as in the Sunnah. That has been really important. But as I said, as Muslims started becoming empires, political and religious started to blend more and more, and the more powerful they felt, the Muslims have resorted more on the offensive interpretations, which was first articulated by Shaybani, who's the founder of the Shaybani school. But I will skip all these. But there is a very strong Islamic tradition of nonviolence, because jihad is an integral part of Islamic tradition. And many scholars today who are coming from a nonviolent Islamic practice argue that because the current modern warfare does not allow us to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, it is not possible for Muslims to use war as a weapon. But because jihad, fighting for justice, has to be an integral part of a Muslim life, how do we do that? So they look at nonviolent activism as a way to pursue peace and justice in the tradition. And I just want to conclude with skipping all these justifications for that. There are two very important scholars and practitioners of this. One is Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who is a Pashto, who have established the world's first nonviolent army, and then was able to one of the things he did was that he said he will give the Pathans the most powerful weapon of the Prophet, which was nonviolence. And he gives examples from the Quran and the Prophet's tradition. I'm happy to share those verses and the hadiths to support what he's arguing for, is that was that only someone who's as strong as a Pathan would be able to endure, which was to face war and violence with non-violence, because he argued anyone could face that violence with violence, but it requires a particular bravery and courage to respond violence with non-violence. And he argues that the Quranic verses, such as the verse that talks about the conflict between sons of Adam, where one of the sons says, even if you stretch your hand to kill me, I will not kill you because I fear God, is a very strong indication of why peace through nonviolence is more prevalent and more important, dearer to God than peace through violence. I will end there. I know I might have exceeded my time, but I'm happy to explain or go more in depth in any of these topics later on.
Thanks very much, Ashe. And I'm sorry that you had to skip through some of your slides, but I'm hoping that we can pick it up again in the Q&A session. So don't hold on to those bits.
Okay.
Please. Thank you so much. Rumi, I invite you, please.
Thanks very much. And thank you very much for that very comprehensive overview, Dr. Kavachi Oriana. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a more specific version of the phenomenon that was just discussed, which is about developing religious literacy around this topic amongst negotiators, and more importantly, perhaps after the negotiation is done, to develop religious literacy amongst people within Afghanistan, to be able to speak back and to be able to say to the Taliban that your interpretation is just that, it's a single interpretation, and that there are other interpretations of Islam, not only broadly, but even from within your own tradition. So let me give you a little background on the project that myself and my colleagues have been involved with. We've been pushing for some time to develop religious literacy on a political level, particularly in the context of these negotiations. When political actors bring Islam and Islamic law to the negotiating table, or if there is a constitutional clause that says that Islamic law will be the law of the land in this country, Islamic law and Islam becomes in the public interest of every individual. At the point where it becomes part of the negotiating table, if only one party is speaking the language of Islamic law, then effectively they have a monopoly over what it is and it isn't. But one of the things that we're trying to say, building on the works of groups like Women Living Under Muslim Laws and Musawa, is that claims about Islamic law are exactly that. They are claims. Someone may say, I believe that Islamic law is X, Y, or Z based on this particular reading or this particular authoritative structure, but that's one claim among many. And because there is no hierarchy in Islam, every individual has the right to weigh in on what they believe Islamic law is and allow their arguments to hold weight. At present, especially in international negotiations, Islam has been relegated to those who know how to speak the language. But it's a language that can be learned. Individuals, if they spend a little bit of time and maybe with some expertise and help, they can not only develop counter arguments, but look within the Islamic tradition to find different positions that can support claims about democracy, women's rights, peace, reconciliation, not only so that this might influence the negotiations, but so that people on the ground can understand that they don't have to choose between Islam and democracy or Islam and women's rights, but that rather within the tradition holds the seeds of all of these positions. So the government of Canada asked myself and some of our other people who are experts in Islamic law to write a report, particularly with respect to the Afghan negotiations, on this very topic. And one of the things that we note, especially those of us, let me back up a little bit and talk about the Taliban briefly and their take on Islamic law. As the professor just outlined, there's a myriad of positions on jihad, including ones that are very nonviolent, that are completely nonviolent within the Islamic tradition. The Taliban in particular adhere to one school of thought within the Islamic tradition that's known as the Hanafi school of thought, which the professor also discussed. Within the Hanafi school of thought, the Taliban adhere to one particular subset, which is known as the Deobandi tradition, which emerged in the 19th century. So some of us scholars who are familiar with the Hanafi Deobandi tradition we're able to look at the Taliban's arguments and say that your own tradition does not justify the claims that you are making. And we can look at that very same subset of a tradition that you are calling upon to show that your arguments do not have historical legitimacy. So myself, my colleagues, Dr. Aisha Chaudhry and Dr. Anwar Iman put together a report where we looked at governance, women's rights, and jihad within the Hanafi Deobandi tradition to show that their own tradition promotes, for example, women to hold the highest offices, to work, to travel, freedom of travel, to power sharing, democracy. And I'll talk a little bit about jihad. Within the report, we have, of course, extensive footnotes about the authorities that the Taliban themselves hold to be authoritative. I won't get into the technicalities of the argument, but rather just to show how even a kind of broad understanding of the kind of arguments with respect to jihad can be brought to the negotiating table and can be stated on the ground in communities to provide a different view of Islamic law, even from within the Hanafi Deobandi tradition. So in the context of jihad, there are three major historical positions that we highlight to demonstrate that the type of jihad that the Taliban are promoting is not justified by their own Hanafi Deobandi tradition. It rests on a theological principle in Hanafi law, which holds that a strong separation between faith and actions, which is to say that if someone commits a sin or a heinous action, that does not make their faith any less. Everyone, if they say that if they say that they believe in God and that Muhammad is the messenger of God, they are an equal Muslim, and no one on earth can impugn their faith. It was a point of pride for the Hanafis. They actually stood out amongst the legal schools for saying no one gets to judge the faith of anyone else on this realm. The importance of that leads into the political sphere, because there is a legal principle that Muslims are not allowed to fight Muslims. They cannot engage in warfare against them. They cannot rebel against a Muslim government. It doesn't matter whether they think that the Muslim government is illegitimate. It doesn't matter if they think they're good or bad Muslims. Because you're not allowed to impugn the faith of any other Muslim, you are not allowed to fight against a Muslim government and call it jihad. You can, if you choose to have an insurrection or a rebellion, call it that, but you can't call it an Islamically justified jihad. So then the question, the point comes in, okay, well, that's not jihad. What is jihad? According to the Hanafi Deobandi tradition, when there is a Muslim government, the only jihad that is that can be justified is what is known as, it's part of a communal obligation jihad, fardul kifaya, which involves policing borders, maintaining public security, basically maintaining the peace. And it is not a jihad in which there is fighting, but a jihad in which there is protection, much as Professor just discussed about defensiveness. If someone were to attack, you maintain a group of individuals who can push back and defend the country. These ideas are not foreign. In fact, they are central to the Hanafi Deobandi tradition. But unless there's someone to push back and to say, actually, your own tradition disagrees with you, the Taliban get monopoly over what is and what isn't Islamic law. And so one of the things that we want to suggest is that developing this religious literacy is crucial, not only for negotiations, but for daily life. The goal is not necessarily to convince the Taliban that they're wrong, but to at least be able to put forward a counter narrative that justifies the Islamic basis of a polity in which there is a dedication to constant peace, to women's rights, to shared governance, and to a vision of jihad that promotes peace as opposed to war. I think I'll stop there just as a kind of overview, and then anyone who has any further questions, I'm happy to answer them later.
Thank you very much, Professor Ahmed. I think we'll pass now to Professor Hutfa for a few closing reflections, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. If everyone can please type in their questions to me on the chat, that would be great. Homajan, yours.
Well, thank you very much for this excellent, presentation. In fact, I had prepared a little commentary to give, but I think my commentary is totally irrelevant now because we have discussed all the things I wanted to mention. So it's because so it's very important. I think one of the questions for me was how can we discuss jihad in this context? So anyway, I give up my commentary. I just want to just put in some questions which are more political questions rather than religious questions, because now jihad is used so much as politics. So many groups now in Asia, but also in Africa especially, are using the concept of jihad. They may have legitimate grievances, but the fact is most of their actions are not against this national state, but against people, whether this is about burning and killing and abducting nowadays school children. But and those kind of goes, so in a way they're not really say they're not Robin Hoods. They're not taking from the rich, giving to the poor, but they're just a bunch of like criminal. And yet they talk in terms of jihad, and very few people take them on those grounds, like the kind of argument that you and Aisha, you presented here. So that was the two questions. How can we then turn this? But going back to Afghanistan and Taliban, which is really our major concern because of the peace talk. There's so much talk about peace talk, but there's no peace or ceasefire anywhere to be found. So if you're talking about jihad is very central, the debate is very central about the ceasefire. How can we then, Taliban have been killing in war. I mean, there's 110,000 people have been killed in the last 10 years. And then there's more targeted killing. Of course, Taliban are saying they're not claiming responsibility, but they have not condemned this. Many believe that the killing also, even if it doesn't happen by Taliban, is by a splinter group that are very closely connected to them. So if they're not condemning, and so that means in some way you can't, they're supporting, because especially they are the one who leverage in the peace talk about it. The question is, how can we get them engaged in talking about different kind of jihad, presenting this to schools? I mean, it's fine to write and it's fine to present us, but that's a hard thing to do when you have had a culture, 40 years of war under this situation. So, and even if we do get, my question is, even if we do get talk to the ideologue of the Taliban or Taliban type and the leaders, when you have, it's not a 2, 4, 5 years war, you have 40-year war, 20 years at least under Taliban only. So you have two generations that have grown up under this war, and they have a culture. They have, I mean, war creates its own culture. They have their folk stories, they have their songs, their heroes, and then suddenly to come and say all of those were wrong, then how can a society, a community of Taliban, which is made of millions of people, so how can they deal with this? We can't just expect them to change current without actually thinking of the implication for the wider society. So that was one of my concern. And even though I know Taliban are now, I don't want to put Taliban and Daesh and ISIS all in one basket, but in some way they are feeding off each other despite their differences. So, and in this stage, in the context of Afghanistan, Taliban are the most important group that we need to discuss. The other thing that, I mean, the other points were already raised, so I don't want to go through that, but there's also one thing that I know that my Afghan colleagues are always concerned about it. When we talk about jihad and the violent culture, especially Pashto culture, we forget often that in fact, during the Cold War, the Taliban didn't exist in the form that they existed. They're killing, their unjustifiable action and as that would be considered a war crime. All of these things were rewarded by more training and more funding especially by the United States. And they were called freedom fighters. They did the same things as they're doing now, even worse, but then they were called freedom fighter. I'm old enough to remember, many of you do not, but I remember how angry we were at the time. But now the problem is we're talking about jihad and Islam. We forget about the international community roles. I'm not saying we condemn whatever is the past is there, but you can't get to a better future if you don't reflect it in the past. So, and what is important for a lot of my friends from Afghanistan is that no one is talking about that kind of responsibility. The jihad as it exists today amongst the Taliban was not creation of Islam only. It was the abuse of that. And if we don't bring that in to discuss, which maybe would make it easier also for Taliban to question their position, then we'll never move the stage further. The other thing that was important for them was that if we want to bring a culture of peace and nonviolent form of resistance, even when we need the resistance, it's that we have to also question the international community about their flexibility, about their ethics, their values, wherever that is always seemed to be part of their national interest. So you can have an ethics that is tied to your interest only and is not universal. So those kind of hampers this development of a different approach to jihad, especially on the part of the Taliban. And my last comment and questions to our presenter is that how could we mobilize your knowledge, your insight into this question for peace? The fact is, yes, we can educate ourselves and all this, but this is a long process. But we need the ceasefire now. People are being killed every day and every hour. We don't always, only a few gets to the international media, but it happens all the time. So how can we mobilize this knowledge? We can have a long-term strategy of educating ourselves about how to use this. But in the short term, what are the solutions? We now negotiating peace. We are trying to push for peace. But then how can we mobilize your knowledge to benefit the people of Afghanistan, especially women and minorities who stand to lose more if Taliban get their way? And so that's where I leave it to you to comment. And again, once again, thank you very much for this incredibly interesting and presentation.
Thank you. So we'll just maybe each of you would like to answer. I'll leave that to you, please. Aisha and Rumi.
Thank you so much, Homa. And I was also really enjoyed Dr. Ahmed's presentation. I think also there are some really interesting questions and important questions in the chat. Maybe I could just sort of reflect on all of them in a sort of together. One of the things that you said, that this jihad did not come, wasn't part of the historical tradition. I think this relates to the question that was also asked in the chat about this emergence of the Salafi movement. when I was doing my research, when I was looking at the sources of extremist interpretations, I think really understanding the context, how it emerged, and the reasons behind it would give us insights to how we could respond at the same time. One of the really critical moments was that Sayyid Qutb's sort of shift, and it was an interpretation of the Islamic understanding of jihad with vanguardism. He was really very much influenced by the Marxist-Leninist movements of the 60s and 70s. Actually, this context, we've forgotten those years, but it had a really important sort of contribution in the way we sort of understood and supported certain Islamic groups historically. And one of the things that was to my biggest surprise was what contributed to Taliban's interpretation was actually during the war between Soviet Union and Afghanistan, there was efforts to sort of mobilize religiously oriented individuals, especially the groups like Taliban, the refugee boys, in an interpretation that would doctrinate them to fight against the atheists. That was and there was actually a US aid program to do that, where that that used concept of jihad, even teaching concepts like mathematical ideas through guns and etc. There was a really sort of a campaign, and that was not only the US. We had internationally this sort of reaction to Marxist, communist. The Cold War had sort of led many countries and groups to support right-wing, religiously motivated groups as well. So, so of course, the colonial experience was really a sort of a trauma in many contexts. One of the, in addition to creating this reactionary attitude towards the West, in like Boko Haram and others, there's a really strong reaction to Western education. Part of that was because the colonial powers had imposed a lot of their ideas. This includes actually gender norms that are very restrictive. One of the things we were talking earlier today was that the British Puritan ideas of gender roles was very much imposed, and Muslim societies were criticized and eroticized and exoticized for being not fitting in the pure Victorian principles of a good wife and etc. So there was also a cutting off of Islamic education. There was a question about Orientalism as well. So there was this idea that Islam is backward, very much these are like childlike. There was this dynamic that really sort of disempowered Muslims, uprooted their connection to their Islamic history. I mean, if you look, I've been doing a lot of research on this. There were a lot of men and women, Muslim men and women, who contributed to education. The longest running educational institution today was established by a Muslim woman who trained Jewish scholars like Ibn Maimun and popes who introduced the number 0 to Europe. So like there was so much women scholars who invented astrolabes and other like hisabs, the algebra. But we so everything that was imposed now in the face of like, this is Western, you have to do that. And there was this created a sense of rupture in the memory, also created a sense of, you know, we Muslims are backward. So internalized and projected this backward as sort of, I would say, I argue that Orientalism had a sort of a mirror reaction, which I would call Occidentalization, which sort of made the West as if other, and then it created a lot of hostility. The legitimate fears and sense of disempowerment really sort of condense these interpretations, influence these interpretations. Although, and this is not unique to Islamic tradition, in fact, the word fundamentalism was first used in the beginning of 20th century to refer to evangelical Christians who had a similar reaction to modernization. And that, but I think I agree with Dr. Ahmed that literacy is really important, religious literacy. Recapturing, owning our religious tradition is very important. But in the short period, we also have to respond and educate those who are involved in the negotiations of counter-arguments. And we have to create an international pressure towards supporting, but also, but this should be from authentic Muslim voices of, making this pressure and saying that this is not acceptable. And peace is very important from an Islamic perspective. We could talk about that more, but I think ceasefire important, but it cannot bring justice and peace unless we address these other issues of injustice. I'll end there. Sorry, I talked.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll see if I can add something meaningful to that. Thank you. That's a lot, what Dr. Hudfar laid out. So I'll try and see if I can hit some of the points. I mean, as you mentioned, this is a very long, seemingly intractable issue in which jihad is embedded in social, cultural, political production of knowledge, and has been for some time. And it's not simply a matter of, as you mentioned, like Pashtun culture. As you know, during the Carter administration, planes dropped pamphlets all over Afghanistan, and saying that it's a religious duty to engage in jihad against the Soviets. And that kind of rhetoric continued from the international community as we were cheering on the freedom fighters at the time. So that rhetoric has not gone anywhere. Not only that, but there is economic benefit to jihadist networks. Dr. Aisha Ahmed has written a lot about this, that actually jihadist networks are a great way to get goods to market at a lower cost. There is an assumption that there's a feeling that the government of Afghanistan, if you were trying to move goods in, might be corrupt, they might extort you, whereas jihadist networks tend to be a little bit more reliable. So there's an economic incentive, not just from the Taliban, but for people who want to do business in Afghanistan to keep those networks running. And then on top of that, as there's a question about jihadi Salafism. Jihadi Salafism and Salafism in general has been a great boon to authoritarians all over the world. They're a solid bloc whom you can count on to come out and vote for you in your election, however legitimate it might be. And they are a kind of cudgel that many authoritarians use in order to maintain their power. So there's this political, social, economic, historical, cultural background that pushes this particular vision of jihadism. But it's also not unique. That kind of confluence of interests and those kinds of views about violence and fundamentalist interpretations of a tradition are found everywhere. I'm in North America. We have North American militias who have these interpretations of the founding documents of our countries. They tend to be marginal because there is a strong counter narrative against that, unless there's an authoritarian who finds them useful. And you'll see if an authoritarian ruler comes, suddenly these groups gain prominence. So, it would be naive to say that we can just simply make an argument and say that argument will convince everyone and somehow deal with all of those different interests. But this is where international pressure comes in. At the moment, there is no international pressure that is pushing for a counter narrative. There are Muslims all over the world who have these different narratives, but those different narratives don't rise to the level of statehood. And it's not just international actors. There are women within Afghanistan who are working really, really hard and have these different narratives whose voices are not elevated. And that has very detrimental impacts. I'll give you an example of CEDAW, the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Violence Against Women, discrimination against women, sorry. Boy, I don't remember exactly the numbers. Dr. Aisha Chaudhry has written on this. I think there were about 30 Muslim majority nations that expressed reservations to CEDAW. And I want to say something like 18, 20 of them specifically cited Sharia as the reason why they will not ratify this. And there was no one in the international community to say, really? Why Sharia? What is your interpretation of Sharia? Explain yourself. They simply had to say Sharia and all conversation shut down. And this is part of, I believe, a large secular bias that has pervaded international negotiation thus far, where people are afraid to get involved with religious language. They'll say, this is a religious thing. We don't get involved with this. We simply work on the political level. Whereas I think we're starting to understand that there is no hard division between politics and religion, and that we're actually pretty behind the ball in trying to get international pressure through the language of religion, because we've been so invested in quote unquote purely secular solutions. I'm coming to you from British Columbia, which is on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded land of the Musqueam peoples. And we've been trying to push secular solutions for decades more to try to come to some kind of reconciliation. We're finally starting to realize, no, we have to engage in a different kind of language if we actually want to move forward. So, you know, obviously international pressure will not solve the problem, but it can play a huge role in pushing forward a kind of solution and at least supporting those people within the country who are pushing for change. There was a question in there that I'll end with, and that's about you know, Twitter and official statements. Yeah, I mean, academics like myself, like, we know the Islamic legal tradition, but we're terrible at, you know, translating them into websites, into Twitter pages, into easily digestible, clearly understandable not just sound bites, but arguments that people can use. And I think this is where groups like Women Living Under Muslim Laws, Musawa, these are indispensable for taking this kind of knowledge and promoting it on an international level.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for also making my job a bit easier as moderator by taking the questions from the chat. But I do also have other questions. So I'm going to start with a question that I've received as well. This is a question from Malala Habibi, who is a program officer at ICANN, the International Civil Society Action Network, focusing on women, peace, and security. And Ms. Habibi's question, she's sent me a few questions, and I'm going to try to make it into a composite question. Maybe I'll ask two, and this is for all panelists. And the questions are, what do you think is the rationale behind the continuation of the violence by the Taliban according to their version of jihad? So that's one part. And if you permit me, I'll put a second part just perhaps to expand the question. And the other question that she poses is that one alternative for the Taliban would be to present the peace process as a continuation of the struggle through nonviolent means. But based on their jihad discourse and Taliban ideology, how is it possible for them to accept that any further violence during or against the peace process is no longer rightful jihad? So in other words, how can a Taliban rhetoric of peace present the case that peace upholds the commitment to jihad, but through a non-violent jihad? I hope that I've made myself somewhat clear. Thank you.
Maybe I can start with the first one and then pass it over to Professor Khadafji Oriana for the second, because I can answer the question about what the Taliban themselves say about why they're engaging in jihad. Their position has been evolving over the past several years, especially with the introduction of ISIS into the region. So whereas before the Taliban were very comfortable saying, you know, there are good Muslims and bad Muslims, there are Muslims that we are allowed to kill, there are Muslims that we aren't, that actually is in contravention to the Hanafi Deobandi tradition. That's also what ISIS says. And so to differentiate themselves from ISIS, they leaned on the Hanafi Deobandi tradition. In 2015, I want to say, or maybe it was 2016, they acknowledged, yes, Shias are Muslims. Actually, anyone who says that there's only one God and Muhammad is the messenger of God is Muslim, and we're not allowed to fight them. And they shifted their position to say, it's just the government of Afghanistan, they are actually Americans. And so they're not really Muslim. So we see that the rhetoric can shift. And if there were some kind of international pressure, there would be a push to say, you know, that actually your government also, according to your own tradition, you can't fight against either. But there is first of all, there's two things. One is that there is a difference between rhetoric and what we actually see on the ground. You know, they might acknowledge that, yeah, anyone who says the Shahada, the testament of faith, is Muslim, and yet in practice they are killing innocent Muslims. That's, yeah, I mean, they're not necessarily logically consistent with their views. The second thing is there is a pragmatic wing within the Taliban who have an interest in peace, in women's rights, and ending the conflict. And these kinds of religious arguments can strengthen their position in order for them to say, yes, we are Taliban, yes, we are adherents of the Hanafi Deobandi tradition, but we also believe that we need to have a ceasefire very soon.
I'll just try to add briefly. I think Dr. Ahmed is absolutely on point when he talks about the evolution of the Taliban narrative, like all other groups, and the importance of these other groups that are constantly emerging. I think it's really important to recognize and try to understand why some of these groups, some of these individuals choose to join these groups in the first place. Like think about ISIS and other groups, the more they become much more radicalized, and makes it look like Taliban is not as radical as they used to be. And I think there is a competition among these Islamic groups to draw people, and sometimes to draw those people who are really frustrated, who can have no other outlet, who don't feel like marginalized groups. They are sort of being more drawn into these groups as well. Like ISIS and others are becoming more and more sort of present in different places. I am not sure how present they are in Afghanistan. I'd be very curious to hear about that as well. But I know that they have been infiltrating and they've been drawing people from different groups. Within the Taliban, it is my understanding that while there's some people who are much more open to these ideas, they feel pressure from their own ranks, from people who are feeling having a different opinion. I do not have much information about the internal divisions of Taliban and how is that impacting their dynamic, but it would be something really interesting to look into, and then to see how can we create platforms to emphasize and elevate those voices that support more peaceful, nonviolent interpretations and minimize the draw of these more violent interpretations.
Thank you for that. If I could just ask one question, please, and this is for both of you. I found it interesting, Professor Ahmed, also about your argument about the secularism bias. But on the other hand, if I were to argue that perhaps, first of all, you know, Afghanistan has signed CEDAW without any reservation, which is astonishing for everyone. And that is a whole nother story, how it happened. One knows that story well. But I was just thinking that it's in the interest of those so-called Muslim countries that are making that Muslim Shariat argument to maintain that dichotomy between secularism and religious particularism in order to kind of reinforce their authority and, you know, sign reservations to CEDAW. So that's one part of the problem. The second part of the problem is that what happens in things like the United Nations and the, you know, CEDAW and the Commission, CSW, etc. I mean, I'm not sure how much attention the Taliban is paying to those kinds of things. So what kind of pressure would the international community be successful in applying besides economic pressure? So I'm just wondering, what is the way out of this specifically for the context of Afghanistan?
Sure, if I may. So that's a great question. I mean, the concern always is that if we start introducing religious language, especially if we don't have the expertise to really engage in it and defend ourselves, everything will spiral out of control and we'll lose the argument. It's partly a presumption that religion is inherently conservative and that the majority of Muslims are inherently conservative in their views, although polls just suggest that actually they aren't. They're far more progressive than we give them credit for. But the concern still remains of like, how do we introduce religious language on the international stage? The thing is, we're already, I would say we're already a bit too late. not only because countries are using religious language on the international stage in instances like CEDAW, but within Muslim majority countries, there are about 32 Muslim majority nations that have what are known as Sharia source laws, which is a constitutional clause that says this country will be governed by Sharia. It's either a repugnancy clause saying no law will be made contrary to Sharia, or it is a clause that says all laws will be made according to Sharia, but none of them actually define what Sharia is. So from country to country, Sharia looks different. Now, one of the unintended consequences of this is that it has made Sharia the right of every citizen to weigh in on. Dr. Ziba Mir Husseini says that Islamic feminism is the unwanted child of political Islam, that it actually gave rise to these Islamic feminist groups saying, okay, we're citizens, we have every right as much as anyone else now under the Constitution to weigh in on Islamic law. This is our opinion. So there are several unintended consequences that we'll never know about once religion is brought on the stage. But one thing I want to say is that it's already there. And if we don't engage in it, then we grant all the power to those who already speak that knowledge. As for instances in which international pressure makes a difference, one of the most prominent case studies recently has been Saudi Arabia, which has responded to international pressure. Again, like this is not because of Islamic legal arguments, but because certain Islamic legal arguments align with their political, social, and economic interests already, which gives them cover to make changes that they want to make anyway. So there's no straightforward answer that I can give you, but I would say that it's to our detriment if we don't engage in it, and the possibilities are, there are unforeseen and potentially limitless possibilities for engaging.
If I may add very briefly, I completely agree. I think in addition to UN, we also have to look at Organization of Islamic Countries as well, but also there's a lot of political competition between Islamic states. One of the reasons I think this is becoming an issue, and every country is interpreting that there's no hierarchy within the Islamic tradition on who gets to talk about what Sharia is. But one of the interesting things about CEDAW is that in the context of African Union, they have developed a protocol called the Maputo Protocol, which is really interesting, and which looks at and argues that if traditional and cultural norms contradict the dignity and rights of women, then it doesn't go against the culture or religion, but it says that the purpose of those religious and cultural traditions is not to undermine women. And Maputo Protocol replaces that. It has worked in some Muslim countries as well to get some of the rights of the woman. Women have been able to use that as well. I don't think there's an equivalent of that in other contexts around the globe, that as far as I know, maybe I just don't know. But I think I agree that there has to be an international pressure, but the international pressure should also include strong Muslim voices, men and women, to press these. And I think we have to also carve ourselves a space, both in the social media, but also other media spaces, because we don't give, I think one of the other impacts of secularism has been that we have excluded all of these, especially I come from Turkey. In Turkish context, the society is so clearly divided, what you watch, what you do. And if you bring issues of religion into secular circles, you're really automatically judged. And so I think we have to find a better way of mediating those divisions within ourselves, and then find ways to create tools and use the institutions that are already there, international and local, to make those pressures.
Thank you very much. I'm just going through my questions. I don't have any questions in the main chat, but I see one about just following up on Homer's question, aspect of peace building. So I would take that as a comment, and I think perhaps our speakers have already answered the last part, which says what would be the practical methods. But if there's anything you would like to add to that, what would be some practical methods to host or support communities engaging in counter-narrative discussions. So I'll post that last part.
I'd actually like to add to that, if you don't mind, which is that there's no one size fits all. We're talking about the context of a peace negotiation in which the decision is made at a high level. And so the negotiating room, international pressure, this all plays a very strong role, but that isn't the case for every social issue. So for instance, I'll take the example of female genital mutilation. Egypt instituted a ban on it and said, it's not Islamic, you can't do it anymore. And 5 years on, the numbers suggest that it hasn't made much of an impact. In the Gambia, on the other hand, the methodology that they used was to partner with local leaders and local imams. There was a faith-based organization, an international NGO that educated imams on why female genital mutilation is actually a violation of Islamic law, went into communities, and the practice is almost gone amongst Muslims in Gambia. So that's like one example of how, depending on the issue at hand, there are multiple different ways to approach it through religious language.
Thank you very much, Professor Ahmed and Professor Kadayevchi. I have one question from Ariane Brunei, which says, my immediate concern is in the here and now, the Trump-Taliban process, knowing that this process is seen by many West and North African civil societies as a free pass for Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and others, as a way to encourage these organizations and to attack state administration. So, how to strategize to eliminate peace processes that are not about peace. And it's in the chat if you'd like to just take a quick look at that. Thanks, Ariane. So I'll leave it to either of the professors to answer, please.
I can try to respond as much as I can. And I do think that sometimes well-intended outsiders who do not understand the context and the dynamics of a situation can do more harm than good. And the way they, for example, frame the negotiations itself can be a problem. I'll give you an example. Some of the women from Yemen and also Afghanistan were talking about the way UN, which claims that they're very much about incorporating women's voices, but the way they just set it up, the way they organize the event is made in such a way that really automatically excludes women. And they found, for example, sometimes it was those institutions and the members of those institutions, they created an obstacle that they didn't realize was an obstacle for women as well. So I think understanding the local context is really, really important. And sometimes when we sort of try to do peace for the sake of just peace without balancing it with justice, and then not having an inclusive process that would ensure that different voices are heard, what we are going to be doing is replicating the situation where the problem emerged in the first place. I think it's really important to address that issue.
Right. Thank you very much. I do think that perhaps Ariane's question is really the way in which organizations like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram hijack the peace process to their own political ends. So what can we do for that? So how can we eliminate those kinds of organizations? So I'm not sure, Professor Ahmed, if you could perhaps speak to that.
I have no idea beyond what one of the people said in the chat: good quality education, reduction of poverty, and promote equality. Basically, having creating a situation such that these groups are not necessary, like they're not attractive to the people within those countries. Other than that, I don't know.
Thank you very much. I mean, these are really difficult questions. And Homa has a question, and I'll just hang on a minute.
Well, I have actually a question. A friend just sent a question to me about the status of non-Muslims and how do we, in the context of especially, peace talk in Afghanistan, but generally, the status of non-Muslim in the Muslim context it seemed to vary from country to country. But in the context of Afghanistan, the Taliban have said, okay, they see the Shiites as Muslim, but what about the Hindus, the Christians, the others who are there? And that doesn't seem to be an issue to discuss. And so that's quite important because a lot of the religious minority people have left Afghanistan. But that's also the same, I expand that question to Egypt. I mean, like especially in Egypt with the 25% of population in 1980s were the Coptics, but now there are a small percentage because a lot of them didn't feel safe and they left. And that goes on for a lot of other countries, especially Indonesia, given that now a lot of the larger, especially larger countries have, like Nigeria or Indonesia, have large population of non-Muslims, but the state is Islamic, the so-called Islamic, or the laws are. So what are their status in that context? So
I mean, I could say that from a Hanafi tradition, there's a very well articulated argument within the Hanafi tradition about the rights of the non-Muslims. But I think one of the important elements, I think one of the participants have noted that many of these issues are not really the religion is not easy to separate from the political dimensions. I think we are going through a very nationalist, very tribal almost mentality everywhere. And but the problem is that when people use religion to justify their perspective, religion is never really the real cause of any of these conflicts, but religion is often used as a form of legitimization. And the ignorance or the lack of knowledge in that area really disarms the opponents when, especially if you're coming from a community that is very much religiously based. I mean, I could give you Hanafi arguments of why Muslims have not only should protect the non-Muslims, and they have various rights that are very comparable to human rights arguments. But I think it's really important for us to understand and transform this nationalist, ethnic, divisive politics that is happening, and that requires us to articulate these in religious terminology as a strategic tool, because that's what they're using to disarm the population. It's a sort of a power balancing legitimacy tool, but I think that's not enough. We have to go beyond, and I think understand the mentality that is creating these divisions and respond to that in their own contexts.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just read out a comment made by Dr. Seema Samar in the chat as well, if I could have your responses, professors, to this one. And she says, yes, it's important to understand the culture, but respect for culture shouldn't be used as an excuse not to talk about women's rights. So in the context of Afghanistan, what would your response be? Any comments?
I mean, I would completely agree with that statement. You cannot use culture. A culture is a living, evolving thing. It's never a unified whole. There are certain parts of our cultures that are very detrimental to different groups, including women, but then there are parts of the culture that are elevating. I think we have to recognize that culture is never a justification for harming any member of any society. This includes women, and we have to defend and stand up for that. But that doesn't mean that we disrespect culture. We find sources within that culture would support respect, dignity, and value of every human being.
Thank you for that. I'll end with one last question, and that is, what would we see in the potential of peaceful jihad? How can we, in other words, persuade the political powers in Afghanistan and internationally to focus on the peaceful aspects of jihad? I'm reading that from Malala's question, please.
I'll just say briefly that my experience so far in the negotiations is that the government is actually fully behind the idea that jihad is only in peaceful means. You know, I don't want to sit, and I wonder if the question is, how do we convince the Taliban that jihad is primarily peaceful? And, you know, as I know for myself, I'll speak for myself, and I see this reflected in many of the negotiations, is that we want a simple solution to a very complex problem. Islam, Islamic law, Islamic religious ideas, they are not going to bring peace like on their own. This is a very deeply entrenched problem in which religion weaves its way through political, social, and economic issues. And so it's one tool that we need to be able to engage in order to solve a much larger problem. You know, Dr. Hodfar mentioned like all these different countries. It's and the status of non-Muslims, like in a lot of these countries, they've just patched together different you know, mechanisms, parallel court systems, parallel laws for different minorities. I mean, the ideal would be to say that every citizen is equal, regardless of their belief, their gender, their, you know, what ethnicity, whatever it is, but we're not there. We're in this kind of mess of governmental political systems that are shot through with all kinds of ethnic and social conflicts. And so pulling that together is going to be very, very difficult. This is one thread, I think, that we're talking about, and that is the religious one that we're woefully underprepared on.
Yes, it is a complex, very complex situation. I think one thing to do is to look at successful examples. And I would give you the example of the Ghaffar Khan, and from the context of the Pashtuns, one of the things that he was able to do was to understand the positive resources from the Pathan culture. And these were bravery, being very brave, fearlessness, and value of oath and honor. So what he did was to say to them that only someone as brave as a Pathan could endure and resolve their conflicts non-violently. And then he was able to create an army, literal army, where there was an oath. And in this oath, a Pathan had to make an oath of non-violence to the end. And so he was able to convince the community at the time, which was known to be pretty much attached to their weapons, and both men and women of the Pathan society at the time when he was writing and operating was very much involved in like a very aggressive understanding of what is strength. And we do live in societies where we associate power with violence. And this is not only within the Afghan context, everywhere. We think power is violence, force is power. And so we have to shift that mentality. But there have been very successful examples. And I think going and looking into some of these examples and then thinking about what are the elements, what are the values of these examples that could be applicable in this context is very, very important.
Thank you very much for that. If there are no further questions, as I see, I think that we'll pass it over to Amanda, please, to give the vote of thanks to our distinguished speakers, please.
Hi all, I'm Amanda. I'm a student at the Faculty of Law, and I'm also working at the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism and with women living under Muslim laws. So on behalf of the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism and women living under Muslim laws, we thank you so much for coming. To our distinguished guests, Dr. Kadayefci Oriana, Dr. Ahmed, and Naureen Shameem, thank you very much for agreeing to participate in this event and for sharing your experience and expertise with us. Many thanks also to Professor Naureen and Professor Hodfar for facilitating the talk. If you enjoyed this event, the fourth event in this series hosted by the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism and Women Living Under Muslim Laws, Breathing Life into the Constitution of Afghanistan, the Role of Judges, will take place Monday, April 12th at 10 a.m. To receive updates on this and other events held by the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, please join us on social media at McGill CHRLP. The handles will also be posted in the chat. The links to our Facebook, so once again, thank you so much for coming.